Welcome to the Military OneSource podcast. Military OneSource is an official program of the Defense Department with tools, information, and resources to help families navigate all aspects of military life. For more information, visit militaryonesource.mil.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Bruce Moody. Across the country are families with a loved one who gave the ultimate sacrifice in battle. We'll hear from two families today. They'll share their stories with us. These are stories which have been pieced together meticulously over the years. Much of that work is done by something called the American Battle Monuments Commission. This is an agency that honors the service, the achievements, and sacrifice of more than 200,000 U.S. service members buried and memorialized at sites around the world. And we'll learn more about the important work done by this commission as we hear from our guests. So let's go ahead and bring them into the podcast. So welcome to Gretchen Wronka and Paul Stouffer.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, thank you very much, Bruce. I'm excited to be talking to your audience. I was a military mom myself. My oldest son, Peter, was on the USS Ranger during the first Gulf War, so I have a sense of what some of your audience may have experienced and are possibly experiencing now.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to get to a lot in this conversation. We're also going to be hearing from representatives from the American Battle Monuments Commission during this discussion. These are individuals who have worked directly with the families. They've been working with them for years. You're going to hear a lot of familiarity. They've really gotten to know each other extremely well. That will bear itself out in today's conversation. And of course, for those of you who are listening to today's episode, we welcome you to share your thoughts, impressions. Maybe you have a story to share, or maybe you have a question about what you hear today. We have a link in the program notes for that. So let's get right into it. Gretchen, I want to start with you. I really want to just sort of step back and give you the opportunity to share your story.
Well, thank you, Bruce. My father, First Lieutenant Loren E. Hintz, was a P-47 pilot. He was born in Iowa. He spent some time in the Coast Artillery after Pearl Harbor on Oahu. He was flying with the 79th Fighter Group 86th Squadron. He landed in October of 44, and then he talked a little bit discreetly in letters to my mom and in his journal about some of his missions, which were bombing bridges and railroad tracks as the Germans were retreating farther north along the Gothic line. So as a child, mother was a resilient woman who really was very, very proud of her husband. She raised my brother and me to be proud, but she didn't talk a lot about our dad. Everybody knew the war was over at the end of April. But on May 1st, she received a letter sadly confirming that her husband, First Lieutenant Loren E. Hintz, was missing in action. The small cupful of human remains found at the crash site after the war was over was what was left to prove that my dad had been killed. So there was that sense of courage on the home front to all those women, all those mothers, all those wives, girlfriends. So mother chose to have dad's remains buried in what was the newly built American Battle Monuments Commission Cemetery in Florence. And our life went on. We had closure. That's where dad was. So there was no wondering. Fortunately, we were not, like so many people who never did know what happened to their dad or their uncle or their brother. So early in the 2000s, my mother was in a senior facility in Iowa, and to give her something to do, we went to the local public library, and I said, "Wow, let me show you how this internet works, Mother." So we typed in P-47 pilots, and a website for a P-47 pilot reunion came up, and I typed in, "Did anyone train with Lieutenant Loren E. Hintz, yada, yada." And I got one hit back from a guy who'd been in flight training with Dad, and he was thrilled. So that was the end of it until about 2012, when my son and I both got a message from a guy named Piero Fabri introducing himself as an Italian World War II buff and an amateur aviator. And he and his friends were very interested in the reports of the pilots who had crashed and died in the area outside of Bologna. Well, it turned out to be absolutely legit. Piero and his colleagues had gone through all the flight reports, and they had pinpointed my dad's crash site as a small village outside the Italian city of Bologna. And so the real story begins. On a very hot day in July of 2016, Piero and ADA had been looking in a farm field on one side of three houses, but Tonino said, no, I saw the trajectory of the plane coming down. It was on the other side. And that's how they knew where to start to dig. The other fascinating person that we met was another young teen who'd actually been in school with Tonino. And when Dad's plane was shot down, he was tail end Charlie in the last flight of 12. They were on a bombing run. It was a German sharpshooter in a trench, got a very lucky shot. And anyway, the plane crashed, exploded into fire. So that plane was covered up for 75 years and nobody thought about it and nobody talked about it. And this is when the story with ABMC starts. So here we were on this farm field. It's still a farm field being tilled every other year. And this little backhoe started chugging away and the whole crash site was marked off. And people driving by, there was a lot of attention locally. More and more cars started stopping and people started filling into this field. And my brother and I were there with his two sons, his daughter. I was there with two of my sons and a couple of my grandchildren. And the mounting tension, that first little dig into that clay. And, it was a farm field, but it was the symbolism of all of this was just kind of overwhelming for my brother and me. They got the excavators, went down deeper and deeper, and all these small pieces, a flare gun, two machine guns, which the crowd was just mesmerized. Something started showing. And the diggers were beyond thrilled because it was part of the engine. Not only part of the engine, but the guys got down there into that hole, which was about 16 feet deep, and they started putting chains around this hunk of metal, a great big glob of dirt encrusted something. And very, very slowly, you could smell the oil. It was just, unbelievable. And it was like they finding gold. Someone called me over to the edge of the pit, and there was one of the Italian women had a pail of water, and she was holding a white cloth, and she was washing something in the water, and it was the tenderest kind of experience. It was like watching someone wash a baby, how gently you just went over, and she put this item in this cloth she was carrying, and she held it up to Martin and me, and it was a dog tag. And everyone was just mesmerized. And that dog tag was a little corroded. You couldn't see. It was bent. But then they kept digging, and they found a second dog tag. Again, that gentle washing, holding it out, and it was very clear. Loren E. Hintz. And to touch and a little bit of the chain left on it. And the feeling I had when I touched that and my brother, it was just almost like we were touching a part of the father we never knew. Martin was born 6 weeks after our dad was killed. I was 9 months old when Dad went overseas, so I at least have a picture. But Martin had nothing. So then the archaeologists were even more careful, and every bit of earth was sifted. And there was one of the volunteers was a nurse, and as she went through some of these clumps of clay, she held up a couple of things that looked just sort of like stones or something, and she said, "These are human remains." This was all in Italian, and our friend Piero was was doing the interpretation. And at that minute, they stopped digging. They called the local priest, and he came rushing over on a motorcycle, and he looked like a modern day St. Francis of Assisi, in sandals and a kind of a poncho thing. And it had never really occurred to me that they might really find bone fragments. And the archaeologists had a little box, and they had a little tent set up there. So they put those fragments in this box. And my brother and I actually, we held our dad's part of his femur, these shards of bone in our hand. And it was just, you can't describe it. Those bones had to be identified through DNA, and it was ABMC and Mortuary Affairs that helped us with that. But I think a new friend on this podcast is Paul Stouffer from Montana, and his family had an experience finding an uncle's remains, and again this link between people as this story keeps going on. Turns out that Paul's uncle was from Minnesota, that I have a connection with his first cousin who was part of the burial at Normandy. And Paul, I'm going to let you go on and tell about your dramatic experience.
Thank you, Gretchen. That was a great connection. After the first call, Gretchen and I exchanged a few emails. So the connections continue. But it really is an honor to be here. I was raised in a military family, and my father was a career Air Force pilot. On my mother's side of the family, service and sacrifice by members of our military has always held a very special place with me. My family's connection with ABMC actually dates back to the First World War. I have 3 relatives who are buried at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery in northeastern France, one of whom was my grandmother's older brother, Private William Donnelly. My great-grandparents to have their sons' remains stay in France and be buried at the cemetery in the Meuse-Argonne. That would play a significant role with my generation's decision about where to bury the Donnelly's grandson after his remains were found and identified about 100 years later. Their daughter, Mary McGowan, who is my grandmother, gave birth to a son she named William after the brother that was killed in World War I. Everyone called him Bill. After high school, Bill attended the University of Missouri, where he studied journalism. He was in his senior year there in late 1941 when the U.S. officially became engaged in World War II. A few months after his graduation, he started the arduous process of attaining that goal with basic training. And finally, in December of 1943, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and awarded his pilot's wings. And he also happened to be assigned to fly the P-47 Thunderbolt, just like Gretchen's father. During his final training in the P-47, Bill married his longtime sweetheart from Minnesota, a woman by the name of Suki Schaefer. 2 months after the wedding, Bill boarded his transport ship, crossed the Atlantic, and was soon flying missions in Europe from his base in southern England. And Bill was with the 366th Fighter Group and the 391st Fighter Squadron while based in England. On June the 6th, 1944, the day we now recognize as D-Day, Lieutenant McGowan was flying on a mission in support of the U.S. troop landings on Utah and Omaha beaches when his plane was hit by enemy flak, just 500 feet above the railroad station he was targeting. One of the pilots flying along with Lieutenant McGowan saw the plane get hit and completely engulfed in flames, travel about 3/4 of a mile further before exploding on impact in an open field. Lieutenant William McGowan, a man that we just knew as Uncle Bill growing up, was just 23 years old when his plane crashed that day. There was really no doubt that anyone could have survived a crash of that magnitude. Once the fire from the crash had run its course, there were attempts to locate the pilot's remains. The farmer whose field the plane had crashed collected badly charred pieces of the pilot's body and buried them next to the plane's propeller, which had embedded itself in the field. Back home, his wife, Suki McGowan, received the official notification from the War Department advising that Bill's plane had been seen going down and that he was officially missing in action. 1 year and 1 day after the crash, Suki was informed that her husband was now presumed dead. In 1947, 3 years after the crash, the American Graves Administration paid their first visit to the crash site. Along with a search for remains, they were able to confirm with serial numbers from parts of the plane they found that this was indeed the P-47 that Lieutenant McGowan had been piloting on D-Day. But no remains were found. And so Bill's official status was that he was declared dead, his remains were unrecoverable, and that he was officially missing in action. In 1953, my grandparents made a trip to France with their 2 daughters, including my mother. 2 places on their travel agenda were the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery to visit the gravesite of William Donnelly, and Normandy to visit the small village of Montserrat and the crash site of their son. About 15 years ago, I began paying closer attention to the work of the U.S. government and their agencies' work to find missing soldiers and airmen from past wars. When World War II servicemen remains were located, I would read that the number of those still missing was something like 75,000. And I thought surely with more efficient technology, including the use of DNA, there might be an opportunity to remove Lieutenant McGowan from the list of the missing soldiers. So it was quite the ride in the years that followed, but in the summer of 2018, the Defense Personnel Accounting Agency was finally able to conduct a site in Montserrat. And about 9 months later, after the DPAA had conducted the appropriate lab testing with their findings, we got the call that the remains recovered in the field outside the village were in fact those of Lieutenant William McGowan. So at that point, he was no longer missing. It was a pretty emotional moment for me, knowing that my grandparents and his sisters and his wife never heard this news. My experience with the ABMC staff really started when my sister and I met with the DPAA in 2017. They asked us basically, should the search for our uncle be successful, had we given any thought about where we wanted his remains to be buried? And we really hadn't discussed it, but Ann and I looked at each other and then almost simultaneously asked our DPAA representative if he could be buried at the Normandy American Cemetery. Uncle Bill's remains, after all, had lain in the field less than 10 miles from that cemetery for nearly 75 years. And our family had also developed some wonderful connections with the people there, going back to when family members traveled to Normandy shortly after the war looking for answers. And so it seemed like a natural fit. I mean, in less than 24 hours, they forwarded an email from the superintendent of the Normandy American Cemetery who said they would be honored to have the burial there. And that was really my first contact with the ABMC. And finally, we pulled the trigger in 2022. And ABMC was with me every step of the way with the planning, the logistics, and most important, the delivery on the day that mattered most. And that was the day that the family of Lieutenant William McGowan were finally able to lay his remains to rest. And because of that experience, I can never thank the ABMC for all of the support they showed me, my family, and all the people that made the trip to Normandy for what turned out to be just truly an incredible ceremony. And that ceremony was topped off by the superintendent himself placing the rosette next to my uncle's name on the wall of the missing, indicating that Lieutenant McGowan was no longer missing.
I really want to express my gratitude to the both of you for sharing your story. I don't have that kind of a story in my family. It's something that many families across the country have experienced. I personally don't have this, and this has been a real view into what takes place here. And one of the things that really strikes me is just the connection that was existing all of this time between you and the folks in the towns, and how everybody had a piece of the puzzle, and it was almost hoping at some point that they would have the opportunity to contribute their piece of the puzzle to kind of solve the whole mystery. What are your thoughts on that?
That's exactly what happened, Bruce. The people in that little town of Budrio Bagnola and a nearby San Pietro Castel Terme were thrilled. And it went all over Italian news. So people recognized us on the street, and they had the same message over and over again. Thank you to you, your family, for your sacrifice, but thanks to all the Americans who came to save us from fascism.
What I'd like to do is bring in ABMC folks. As I'm listening to the both of you talk, I'm hearing you answer a question that I've had in my mind, which is the decision to have your family member interred overseas, for example, at the Florence American Cemetery versus your hometown cemetery. It does seem that this is, as you say, as much about having your family member with his colleagues, but it also seems like the people who are local to these cemeteries have a stake in the story as well. And I'm really getting a sense of why we have these overseas monuments and cemeteries. And with that, perhaps this would be a good time to bring in folks from the American Battle Monuments Commission that you've worked so closely with. So I'd like for you to go ahead and introduce them into the discussion.
A couple of days after the excavation, my family and I and our Italian friends journeyed from the Bologna area up to ABMC Florence to see the actual gravesite. And at this point, I had not been in contact with ABMC. So we all went up to the gravesite, and at that point, I said, well, is it going to be possible to add the remains that we excavated outside of Bologna to the grave that's right here? And Angel wasn't sure, because this was a closed cemetery. After the end of the war, there were no more burials at ABMC Florence. And he said he would look into it. And this began a relationship which has deepened into a friendship. And so after the bone fragments were identified as Loren's, ABMC just launched into the most extraordinary action. Yes, we can have this burial. Yes, you can plan it. Yes, you can have a brass quartet from Florence play live music. Yes, you can have the grandchildren lay a wreath, the great-grandchildren rather. It was with extraordinary courtesy, and all the time my brother and I were talking about this, we thought about all those thousands of other soldiers buried there. And when they were buried, I'm assuming that there was ceremonies when that Florence Cemetery was built right out of the Etruscan land. It had been a fruit farm. We found that really pretty symbolic too, farm boy to fruit farm grave. But we thought perhaps we as one family, every single one of those soldiers buried in that cemetery has a family. They have a story. My brother did some looking around. He did some research into Dad's gravemates, and he found one, Private William Haskins, a black guy buried right next to him. Here's Dad sailing to war on a segregated troops ship, and there he is in the cemetery. So it was wonderful when Eryth and I were talking about this last week, and she emphasized that one of General Pershing, who was the World War I general who insisted that these cemeteries be built, one of the things that he emphasized the most was there would be no segregation. There might have been segregation in World War I military and in World War II, but in death, there is no segregation. So we were so pleased about that. So when Angel went to extraordinary efforts, he got the dozen long-stemmed red roses to be by the podium. The night before the burial, it had poured rain. It was a cold November day, pouring rain, sheets of rain coming down. We found out later that Angel and the entire green team had spent the night bailing out the open grave, and so that it would be perfect on the day of the memorial. And the courtesy, Angel was able to get 50 active duty young military members, men and women, from Alvino and Darby Air Force bases to attend the funeral. 2 young women were the memorial guards all night in the chapel where Dad's remains were in their burial box, which was actually a friend of mine built it out of Iowa oak. And the extraordinary attention to detail of that green team, as though they were preparing for their own family's funeral, but again, watching them in action. And again, having the honor to be part of the ABMC Centennial Commemorative Film, to see the daily work that green team does in coordination with the superintendent and the other staff to make sure that the cemetery was not just in pristine condition for one family having a burial and memorial, but for everybody who comes to visit. When I was looking out as Martin and I were giving our remarks, and I saw that group of young airmen and women in uniform sitting there listening, I literally got chills. I kind of feel those chills now, because those young people in today's military and their families are the ones who are honoring and perpetuating the legacy of our military in peacetime. Let's hope forever.
Eryth, I want to bring you into the conversation at this point because you're with the American Battle Monuments Commission. You've worked with Gretchen. That's an understatement. It's a relationship at this point. But really, please introduce yourself and talk to us about what the commission is doing.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for having me. I am the superintendent of the Florence American Cemetery. And as you said, the relationship between the American Battle Monuments Commission and the families of the service members interred here and memorialized on our walls of the missing begins from the moment that family makes that really almost impossible decision of having their loved one interred in one of our cemeteries. And so the American Battle Monuments Commission, we are over 100 years old, and we were created back in 1923. And our sole mission is to commemorate and memorialize the service members who are interred in our cemeteries. That entails us taking care of their final resting places, making sure that their service and their sacrifice is never forgotten, telling their stories, having commemorations. For example, for all of the years that Loren Hintz has been interred in our cemetery, for the 70 plus years, we've had commemorative events for Veterans Day and for Memorial Day. And we are the promise kept for the families. When the families chose to have their loved one interred overseas, they did it based on the fact that the American Battle Monuments Commission said, in perpetuity, we will take care of your loved one, and we will ensure, in the words of John J. Pershing, that time will not dim the glory of their deeds. So over the years, and as Gretchen had mentioned, her brother visited, her mother visited, Gretchen visited in the 60s. So maybe as a kind of a passive relationship, but that is a very long relationship that American Battle Monuments Commission has had with Gretchen and her family. And I think probably John Bolt would say the same thing about the relationship between American Battle Monuments Commission and Normandy and Paul.
Yeah, John, you want to jump in?
Sure. I'm John Bolt. I'm the assistant superintendent of the Normandy American Cemetery. The cemetery here in France is located right by the coastal village of Cotteville-sur-Mer, which is one of the three villages which overlooks Omaha Beach, which is famous for one of the landing sites for all of the Allies on the 6th of June, 1944. It was the largest of the beaches, and we are possibly one of the most visited sites on all of the people who are here discovering what is a very big heritage area that, which encompasses all of the 5 landing beaches. It's a large site, 172 and a half acres, and we have over 9,300 service members interred here, and another 1,557 names, which are on a wall of the missing. As Paul mentioned, Lieutenant McGowan, his name appeared on this wall of the missing, which for those families who did not have a loved one either to choose to repatriate back to the United States, which of course was a choice offered to the families of World War II. Other families, of course, chose to have them interred here and looked after in perpetuity in conjunction with the promises made by both the United States and in this case, France. And as Eryth and Gretchen both kind of alluded to earlier, is that this cemetery, like others of the ABMC, was inaugurated. This one here was inaugurated in 1956, and at one point in time was closed to interments. But Lieutenant McGowan, he was one of just a handful of Americans who were rediscovered or discovered on the battlefield, and the families were offered the option to have them interred here on the site. So I've been here since November of 2021. So I consider myself very fortunate to have been able to witness the interment of Lieutenant McGowan, welcoming Paul and all of his family here. For me and for all of my team here that I work with, it remains a very powerful, very moving experience that we all reflect on from time to time. It was one of the very special moments that I can remember for my time so far here at this cemetery.
For a family who has a service member who is killed or is missing and they haven't reached out to you, what do you have to offer them, and what would be the first steps that they would need to take?
I would say the first place to reach out would be, we have a virtual database that commemorates and memorializes all of our service members. That's at our www.abmc.gov site. And they can go there and they can search for their loved one's name, and then that will bring up where their loved one is commemorated. So for instance, if they're interred at the Florence American Cemetery, it would show that and then show where. And if they were missing, then it would show where the name was inscribed on a wall of the missing. So we have 26 cemeteries that would be possibilities for somebody to go and look for their loved one. That would be the first step. If they already know where their loved one is commemorated, this is usually my experience. A family member will come in and they'll know that their family member is here, but maybe not exactly where. And of course, when families come in, they are absolutely our most important visitors, because they're here having made a really huge sacrifice in their family, that their loved one stood up and said, yes, I will go overseas and fight for my country. And then they made the ultimate sacrifice. We will help them to find where their loved one is interred. And we have a decoration ceremony that we do with flags. And in my case, we have sand that we can do for sanding the headstone. It's from Anzio, since the majority of our service members died in the Northern Italian campaign. And then if their loved one isn't on the wall of the missing, we'll take them up to the wall of the missing and show them where their name is inscribed. A lot of times, service members would like to know more, right? I know that my loved one fought with flew with the 86th Fighter Squadron, 79th Fighter Group, like Gretchen's father did. But I'm not sure exactly what he did. So we can help them to find some of that information out and help put the pieces together. So John, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, Eryth, I think, captured it pretty well. The only thing I might add is Eryth alluded to there's a special ceremony that we do with, in many cases, families who make the visit to the cemetery. And Eryth mentioned placing the flags of both United States, the country, in this case, where I am in France. And we take the sand from Omaha Beach, which is directly below the cemetery. And whereas we have lots of American families, I expect the case is probably true in many countries, is that in France, there is a great deal of interest by the French and in the cemetery. And there are organizations who they adopt the soldiers, and they make a commitment to come a few times a year and lay flowers and pay respects to the soldiers in the cemetery. And so we welcome them as well. In many cases, these families who have adopted these soldiers, they've taken the time to research the stories of these people. And I think what I enjoy about that, and I try to express this to American visitors, is to let people know that this is kind of a shared history, if you will. This is a story, an episode of human history that's impacted so many people. And whereas the United States has made a commitment to look after the graves of these soldiers here, the local people haven't forgotten and will not forget. As I sit here in my office and I'm looking at just so many different visitors walking by of all different ages this time of year, we're getting lots of young people, lots of young French students and others besides who are coming here to learn about this story. And, Eryth mentioned how we may help people with learning a bit more about maybe their loved one or their family member's story and what they did during the war. One of the roles of the ABMC, which perhaps wasn't immediately obvious, at the time when the cemeteries were inaugurated, is that, here in the case of World War II, this year, we're going to be remembering the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. And in Europe, the war ended on the 8th of May, 1945. And so many of us here on this call, we have either a personal connection, or at least we grew up meeting the veterans or hearing the stories from the people who witnessed the war. We have a responsibility now, I think, to tell the story to new generations who perhaps haven't had that experience of meeting veterans and knowing the stories at a family level or besides. That's increasingly something that is in the ABMC's mission and consciousness that we take very seriously and we do day to day.
And I think also another part of that shared history is not only the host country and the local people and the stories that they have of knowing when the Americans came over, but also every time that we meet a family, we like to know who the service member was before they went overseas. What was their life like? At the Florence American Cemetery, the average age in our field of honor is 19. So it's very young. It's very, very important for us to be able to gather that story from the family members that come in. Hopefully we can also get a photo. And here's the reason why it's important. Because we get a lot of visitors of all ages. And depending on where you are, in Florence, we have a lot of universities here and a lot of international programs that come over. And when we can tell the stories to the university students, and we can show a picture, and we can say, this is Lieutenant Loren Hintz, and this is what he did during the war. But also, he was married. He had 2 children. He had a 9-month-old daughter when he left. He had a wife who loved him very much. And putting all of those pieces together so that this becomes more than a field of white crosses. This is people knowing that there were real people who died and sacrificed themselves for something greater.
Again, each person who comes to memorialize or respect an individual's grave. And everybody is invited. So, Bruce, I think you better get your tickets and be here. Everybody
I appreciate the invite. I can't think of a better conversation to have around Memorial Day. And I want to just express on behalf of everybody here our absolute gratitude. We're going to put the links in the program notes so that people can learn more about the American Battle Monuments Commission. Just want to wrap up by saying thank you so much for being part of this conversation, for sharing your stories, sharing all of the emotions, and sharing the stories that connect us with so many other stories. And so I just want to say thank you, and we appreciate you being with us today.
Well, thank you, and thanks again to everybody at ABMC for the wonderful job you do, and thanks to all those young families who are listening your podcast, Bruce. It was an honor.
I appreciate it. We're so grateful. Thank you all. And want to remind everybody that Military OneSource is an official resource of the Defense Department. Again, if you have any questions or any thoughts to share about what you've heard today, we have a link in the program notes. And be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to your podcast, because we cover a wide range of topics to help military families navigate military life. I'm Bruce Moody. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.